Okay, so forget the kings, forget the castles for a second, and definitely forget the knights. If you really want to find the secret power of the Middle Ages, you have to look at the people holding the purse strings. We're diving into the story of the Hanseatic League. It was this trade network that wasn't a country, didn't have a king, but somehow got so rich and powerful, it changed European history.
It's a fantastic lesson in, economic organization.
Yeah.
What we need to understand is how a group of German merchants created this sort of decentralized empire that controlled the flow of essential goods all across Northern Europe. They were basically the world's first big multinational commercial power. And our mission here is to figure out the specific business strategies and the tech that let them look a powerful king in the eye and say, nope, we're not trading with you.
That's fascinating. So, what was the league exactly structurally? It sounds a bit like a corporation that took over, but you're saying it was just a bunch of towns?
Exactly. It wasn't a single nation state. It was a voluntary union of independent towns, mostly German, and they stretched from the Netherlands all the way to like modern-day Latvia and Estonia. They started forming around the 12th century, and it was really born out of sheer necessity.
And by necessity, I'm guessing you mean danger.
Precisely. Individual merchants, traveling across the North and Baltic seas, they face huge risks, storms, shipwrecks, and just rampant piracy. If you were one ship full of valuable furs or salt, you were an easy target.
So, the origin story is really just a giant security pact. They figured out that by sticking together, by cooperating, they could pool their resources for defense, share the risk, and, crucially, negotiate way better prices when they showed up in foreign markets together.
And that simple idea, that cooperation, became the economic bedrock for centuries of their success. They realized that their most valuable commodity was internal stability. So they created a common set of rules that everyone had to follow. It ensured fair trade, even thousands of miles from home, and created this reliable, low-risk environment for business to just boom in a pretty chaotic world.
Okay, so when we look at that business, the actual stuff they were moving, this wasn't just for rich people. This was the lifeblood of the whole region, right? What was the essential cargo flowing on this Baltic highway?
You're looking at the basics of survival. They moved two main things to keep huge populations fed. First, massive amounts of dried fish, mostly herring from the fishing grounds off Norway and Denmark, moving south where protein was really needed, especially in winter.
And the second was grain.
Yes.
So if there was a drought or a bad harvest somewhere, they could prevent actual starvation.
Rye and wheat, mostly from the fertile eastern Baltic lands, moved west. The Hanseatic League basically acted as Northern Europe's emergency supply chain. If Lübeck's crops failed, they knew they had a guaranteed supply coming from Riga, and that ability to stop a famine gave them huge political power.
But the truly essential cargo, the one item that let all that fish and meat last through the winter, was something they called white gold. We're talking about salt.
You really can't overstate how important salt was before refrigeration. It wasn't just a spice, it was survival technology. Controlling salt meant controlling preservation. The entire fishing economy of the Baltic depended on it.
And there's this great detail, right? The city of Lüneburg became incredibly wealthy just because it sat on top of these huge underground salt deposits.
Lüneburg produced the salt, and the League controlled the routes to ship it out. They funneled that vital salt to places like Scania, where billions of herring were caught, processed, and packed for the winter. Controlling that whole process, from the mine to the curing tables, gave the League economic leverage over everyone.
It was a chokehold on the necessities, but of course they were also moving pure profit items, too.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the wealth from the other products. They moved valuable timber and heavy furs from the forests of Russia and Poland. They acted as the central delivery service for high-quality English wool, taking it to Flanders to be woven into the most expensive cloth in Europe. And of course, high-end Rhine Valley wine moving north to the wealthy merchants.
This whole system, moving literal tons of stuff across stormy seas in the 13th century, sounds like a logistical nightmare. It must have required specialized equipment. What was the workhorse that made all this possible?
It was the Hanseatic Cog ship. And, it wasn't beautiful, but it was perfectly designed for the tough realities of trade in Northern Europe.
What was so special about its design? Did it look different from, say, a Mediterranean galley?
Completely different. The key feature was its hull. Most ships had rounded hulls, but the Cog had this heavy, sturdy design with a flat bottom.
A flat bottom. Why was that such a game changer?
Well, it allowed the Cog to completely dominate the shallow, marshy coastal waters and rivers of the Baltic.
Ah, so it could get into places other ships couldn't.
Exactly. It could sail right up to an unprepared beach or a simple muddy riverbank to load and unload cargo. Deeper-hold ships just couldn't do that. It made trade accessible pretty much everywhere.
So it was less about speed and more about capacity and just getting into tricky harbors.
That's it. It was a cargo carrier, optimized for moving heavy loads over long distances as efficiently as possible. It used a single, massive square sail to catch the wind, which maximized the profit on every trip. That sturdy, reliable ship was indispensable. Without the cog, the sheer volume of their trade would have been impossible.
And because these ships were moving so much wealth, salt, furs, wine pirates must have been a constant threat. How did the cog defend itself?
The design itself was partly defensive. The cog had very high sides, which made it incredibly difficult for a pirate ship to pull alongside and board.
And they had onboard security, I assume.
Yes. They built raised platforms at the front and back of the ship, which they called castles. Not actual stone castles, of course, but defensive positions where archers and soldiers could stand, giving them a high ground to shoot down at any attackers trying to climb aboard.
Okay, so we've covered the ships that moved the goods. But once they arrived, how did they manage this huge international empire on foreign soil? This is where the contour come in, right?
The contour, that's a plural, were the ultimate expression of the League's organizational genius. These were their special foreign trading posts, basically walled-off bases in key commercial hubs like London, Bruges, Bergen, and even as far east as Novgorod.
So they weren't just renting an office, they were setting up permanent, fortified economic embassies in countries they didn't even rule.
Think of them as medieval free trade zones, or mini-states operating inside another country. Merchants would live inside these gated compounds, sometimes for years, dedicated only to Hanseatic trade. And here's the key part. They followed their own Hanseatic rules and laws, not necessarily the local kings.
Wow. That's a staggering amount of political power. They basically bypassed local law to keep business stable.
They did, and these contour acted as permanent collection and distribution hubs. They warehoused goods, negotiated prices, and settled any disputes among the traders themselves. It gave the League a permanent, stable foothold in the most important markets in Europe.
So if you were to walk through a Hanseatic city itself, like Lübeck, what would you see? What were the physical signs of all this wealth?
You'd immediately notice the organization, the discipline. These were bustling communities. The sign of a wealthy merchant was the size of their house, often built from this distinctive red brick. You can still see that Gothic style today. The whole waterfront would be dominated by these tall, massive warehouses built to store mountains of salt, grain, and fish.
And as we said, this wasn't just a spontaneous thing. It was highly managed.
Absolutely. The cities were surrounded by thick stone walls and heavy gates. They were valuable and independent. And crucially, this was a culture that valued literacy and accounting. Merchant kids were taught to read, write, and do math from a young age because you needed that precision to manage the family's international business accounts.
That attention to detail went all the way to quality control, too. To keep that trust, they had to make sure every trader was honest. That's where the guilds come in.
The guilds were the professional organizations that every merchant had to belong to. Their role was twofold: support their members, but also act as a really strict regulator. They ensured quality control, so no one was cheating customers or selling shoddy goods.
They enforced discipline. If you broke the rules, you put the reputation of the entire league at risk.
And the punishment was severe. You could be fined heavily or worse, expelled from the alliance entirely. And being expelled meant losing access to the whole trade network, the protection of the contour. It was like being permanently exiled from the business world.
Okay, but when massive strategic decisions had to be made, like signing a peace treaty or even declaring a trade war, they couldn't rely on a single king. They had this huge assembly, the Hanseatic.
The Hanseatic, yeah. It was the Grand Assembly, the ultimate decision-making body. It wasn't like a modern parliament that meets all the time. Representatives from the cities only gathered when there were really serious overarching problems, negotiating a major treaty, deciding if a new town could join, or allocating resources for a war.
So it was like a proto-European parliament, but for commerce. And Lübeck was usually the host city, the leader.
Correct. Lübeck was often seen as the unofficial capital. The Hanseatic unified their diplomatic voice, which was essential, because their greatest defense wasn't the castles on their ships, it was their economic unity.
Let's talk about that ultimate defense. How did they deal with a hostile king or a local lord causing trouble? They didn't have a giant standing army.
Their ultimate weapon was purely economic, the trade blockade. If a ruler interfered with their business, tried to tax them unfairly, or seize their property, the League could, and often did, vote to just stop all trade with that region immediately.
That sounds like a medieval version of UN sanctions.
And it was devastating. Imagine you're a king who relies on the Hanseatic network for all your imported grain, your timber for ships, your salt for preserving food. Cutting off that supply and the money that came with it was often enough to cripple a region. It forced even powerful rulers to back down and cooperate with the merchants.
That ability to enforce their will is really the core insight here. It proved that economic unity, controlling supply chains, could be way more powerful than a traditional army.
They fundamentally shifted the balance of power in Northern Europe away from feudal lords and toward this urban merchant class. And that system worked for over 400 years.
It's incredible. So if they were so brilliant, so wealthy, and had this devastating economic weapon, why did the League eventually fade away? What broke this incredibly powerful network?
It was a slow decline, really starting in the 16th century. And it was a mix of changing external factors and internal problems. Externally, the world just got a lot bigger.
The age of exploration.
Precisely. The new sea routes, especially the discovery of the Americas, completely shifted the global focus of trade. Wealth and power moved away from the Baltic Sea and toward the Atlantic. Suddenly, controlling the North Sea wasn't the center of the universe anymore.
They were geographically sidelined by globalization.
That's a big part of it. And at the same time, the political landscape was changing. Powerful, centralized nations like England and the Netherlands were emerging. They were building huge state-controlled navies and merchant fleets. And these new nations didn't want some independent foreign league of cities controlling vital trade inside their borders. They started to take back control.
So, externally, they were outmaneuvered by geography and stronger competitors. But what about internally? They lost their core advantage, didn't they?
They absolutely did. Their greatest strength was unity. But over time, that just eroded. The individual cities started focusing on their own local problems, prioritizing their own interests over the collective good of the League.
They started undercutting each other.
Essentially, yes. For example, if the League voted for a blockade against Denmark, one city might secretly go and strike a better side deal just to protect its own profits. It broke that unified front. This internal squabbling meant the Hanseatic lost its power, and the League just couldn't muster the unified political will it needed anymore.
It's a classic story of organizational failure. When the mission becomes less important than internal politics, the whole thing falls apart. And yet, their impact is still so visible today.
Oh, their legacy is tangible. Many German cities still officially use the title Hanseatic City in their names, Hamburg, Rostock, as a badge of pride. And the beautiful, unique Gothic architecture, those massive brick churches and the tall warehouses along the canals, they're physical proof of the centuries of wealth they created.
The Hanseatic League is really the ultimate case study in the power of cooperation. It showed that if different groups unite under a clear set of economic rules, they can create this massive, enduring influence that really challenges the traditional power of nations. It's almost a blueprint for how things like the EU or free trade zones try to work today.
What's so fascinating is that they didn't need to conquer territories or change anyone's religion. They just focused on making the movement of goods reliable and profitable. They proved that, stability and a shared commercial goal can connect people across different languages and cultures.
So the next time you see a massive shipping container or hear about a global trade negotiation, just remember the people who kind of started it all with a flat-bottom ship and a giant pile of salt. Study well, and we'll talk to you next time.